Hello everyone, today we talk about Gallic warfare. We already made several videos about Celtic warfare in general. Today we focus on this area that we have discussed, however, also in the other videos, as it is essentially best documented, especially in documentary terms proper, but not only, I presume, also archaeologically speaking at the end of the day, that represents in fact the most developed Celtic society, right? We will not be explaining now what we define as Celts, right? Generally speaking, we have a very few evidence about these peoples in general. What we know is just not much better defined general frame of martial peculiarities of a group of population that are, definable as the Celts, right? Largely dispersed in Europe and not only. We made a video about the early Germanic identity, whatever we mean by that, right? And addressing this broader ethnological problems that, for the sake of this video, in which we talk mainly about Gallic warfare, we're not interested in, but it's important to stress. Today I will try a bit, as always, but a bit maybe more thoroughly dispel some wargamistic ideas that we have in a positivistic sense about our knowledge about these ancient peoples, the obsession of categorization, right? As if the Celts, after all, fought in such a different way from other Central or Northern, even Southern European peoples. And we will, in fact, more generally try to be very, very clear, as always, I presume, in all the videos we have done. For example, there is one about Gallic wars. It's just an introduction, but if you're interested in, focusing a bit more, at least in the evenemential side of at least that story, those 8 years that, however, bring on our historical table, thanks to Caesar, an enormous lot of information about these populations, what really means, all the identitary traps, how the Celts have been revived in popular culture. If it had been done in a truly historical sense, everything would be fine. But unfortunately, with history, that's always takes an ideological turn. This is valid for every people, but we have to be very honest in the first place, and also not fall in the traps of attributing a huge deal of achievements to these Celtic, whatever it means, by the way, because it's not even a thing. Civilization has surely existed in many aspects, but cannot be compared with, more advanced ones of the Mediterranean, nor the fact that the Romans, as it is evident, took so much in terms of many military material and linguistical elements from the Celtic world, that this equates to a somewhat, greater development of the Celtic world over the Romans. Unfortunately, this is done continuously. There are even certain books that are sold that contain a huge load of garbage. I will at some point make a video about this stuff, of stuff that is actually published and sold, naturally of no academic relevance whatsoever, but still in quantities that I have downloaded some of this stuff just for the sake of curiosity. And you can see there completely, the whole philology, ethnology, history, it's completely distorted just to feed, I presume, an audience. Because if you write stuff like that, it's because you hope that this stuff is going to be sold, and therefore you try to target a group of people who, in this historical delusion, pretend that that there is so much beyond it that is being hidden, concealed, distorted, that the terrible Romans that did so much worse than any other people did, that all these poor Celtic populations that lived in peace and in harmony, and with such a great moral purity. Unfortunately, this stuff is out there around. It's being done basically with every people, right? It just happens that for some political reasons of political social preeminence of certain countries, or this happened also with the Germanic war. Now there's been a revival in this sense, but any ethno-nationalistic approach deals with things in this term. So we've seen it basically in every single historical chapter we look at, right? That there is always this hardcore group of pretty dangerous and mentally deranged individuals who pretend their nation, whatever that means either, is somewhat special, somewhat pure, unique, that has never taken anything from anyone, that is somewhat unchanged throughout the millennia, that it has a moral superiority. These are the things that eventually brought to things like the Holocaust, right, or similar stuff. And I always say such things before starting to talk about this video, so that nobody can presume that this channel, since it talks about specific peoples and countries, whichever they are, is somewhat a fun based pseudo-historical chauvinistic propaganda, right? This is about history, right? And that stuff is for people who are radically inferior from any political, civical, moral, intellectual standard, and we do not address those topics for this regard. And we are proud to discriminate in this regard, historically speaking, those positions, because they're not factual, they're not scientific, they're actually an insult to the average human intelligence, and I will never condone any kind of fanboyism whatsoever in this channel, and any other kind of discriminating people for their stupidity is the only right reason for discriminating someone. The rest is just rubbish. But let aside this, I actually don't want to give the impression either that I have something against the, in fact, historical matter. I love the Gauls specifically. If among all the so-called Celtic peoples, they are objectively the ones that I like the most. That also thanks, in fact, to this broader documentation, but we have it growing, in fact, more sympathetic, also thanks to Caesar's description that is naturally politically oriented. It has to, from one side, show that a specific part of Roman politics and society, that the Gauls were fundamentally an enough civilized people to be integrated into the Roman system. So that these weren't the stereotypical barbarians that were naturally, they weren't Romans, they weren't properly fully civilized, but there was a spark of civilization in them, and Vercingetorix represents a hero, a tragic heroic figure in this sense, that is one that Caesar admired, even if he was about to be wiped away from him after the Battle of Gergovia. And but as you know, the commentarii, the Bello Gallico, are some of the most beautiful, important, and intelligent works ever written in the history of mankind in absolute terms, and they shed so much light and reveal at that point the true understanding of Roman civilization, about this very articulated set of peoples that whoever has read the work since the beginning are divided actually in a different way from the one we usually intend, right? When you talk about the Gauls proper, we should point out that Caesar, for example, separates the Gauls from the Belgians, right? It's what are included instead in the Gauls. There is also the southwestern part of Gaul that is properly here. Gallia est omnis divisa in partes tres, right? And only one is actually Gaul, right? The other is the Belgica, the Belgian area. The other is where the Aquitanians live, and there's other fundamentally frontier area fundamentally that saw also certain other populations, such as the Vasci, for example, across the Pyrenees and so on. And even in here, we stop to Gaul as fundamentally modern, area around today's France and Belgium and wherever, and up to the Rhine, actually, so even part of Western Germany, they naturally are divided today for historical reasons that have loosely to do, after all, with ancient times in the first place, as in fact the Celtic areas, was much, arrived up to Poland, up to the Ukraine, just remaining in Europe and down to the Danube, up to Thrace and beyond in Anatolia with Galatians. The Iberian Peninsula saw a great deal of Celticization at many levels in the north, in the center, and the same Romans, after all, that were fighting in Gaul in the mid-1st century BC were in part actually descending from Gauls themselves, as the Po Valley and part of the Apennines had fundamentally been and the Alps largely had been Celticized, then eventually underwent Roman colonization, and also many of the legions that in Gallia Cisalpina, in fact, so as the Romans called the Gaul from this side of the Alps, from the side of Rome, the other being the Transalpina, so that is beyond the Alps, were Gallo-Roman proper, right? They were fundamentally, in part, Gauls had been Romanized, right? Because this Roman colonists eventually married into local women, and then giving rise, and some were even rise in southern Gaul at the time of the Gallic War proper. In terms of timeline, today we talk fundamentally about, as we were saying at the beginning, we don't have a huge amount of information about these peoples, most especially about the Gauls, specifically the one of Gaul, Gallia Transalpina proper, derived from the commentaries of Caesar, that offer a quite clear pattern of interpretation of who was who in there, what were the slight military differences. But after all, and as I often do when we make this kind of categorically wargamistic styled chapters of videos titled in this sense, we should always emphasize rather the homogeneity of warfare all over the Celtic world, with minor differences that are important, that help us to understand how it was overall, but in detail, but never think that such differences were actually something structurally defining, right? It's something that we see among certain populations, among certain tribes, is generally speaking just sort of declination in different contexts of essentially the same system, right? And there is in fact a lot of misinformation in this regard. I've seen alleged, Celtic experts or fanboys that, even when asking, museum keepers of things like this, if the Celts were inventing, I don't know, the phalanx by some time, like the Greeks did. At this point, you realize that really there's a lack of the fundamentals, right? Shame on me that I have somewhat abandoned the classical warfare themed videos to shift more, starting essentially from the Hellenistic era, but at some point we will have to make a sound explanation of what's the difference, banally, which is not so banal at all after all, between an hoplitic phalanx of Hellenic character and, I don't know, how the same Greeks called, including Celtic troops or the Roman, the Carthaginian, etc., phalanx proper, right? With a language was absolutely uncategorical, and that goes far beyond that sense. So history should be, it's not that in the ancient world there is, as we're saying, repeating actually, a huge deal to learn, right? If you pose yourself problems like those, it's because properly you have never studied the essentials, but exactly for this reason we make these videos to try to make at least a bit of clarity. Then of course YouTube is not the best space to have a sound conversation about this stuff. It's not properly, these are not academic contents, right? We don't look at source after source, but generally speaking, I've been studying this stuff for some years onwards, and even if I am a medievalist, I'm terribly passionate, as you know, about ancient warfare as well. And it's really very important to broaden always your horizon, because the more you do and the more you realize that certain problems, at least you are able to give the true dimension, true importance to certain matters, and realizing what is that is mostly important after all. As you know, wargamism is fundamentally based on which kind of weapon these troops used, right? While the most important thing is not even about strategy, it's probably about politics and society. So we'll try to address briefly these things. For the rest, there is a whole playlist dedicated to Celtic warfare, so you can go check that if you're interested as well. So Gaul, in this quite based Atlantic plain and other subalpine areas fundamentally was not a nation proper, right? The Gaul, even in here we could open an endless digression what we mean, what the Romans meant by natio, and what the picture that they made of the Gauls was functional for their own Roman politics and society. So never fall into tricks like presenting that this was a, Gaul definitely had a unity at some level, as any people, any group, right? This is a perspective that we should always be very careful about, because it's mostly obvious that the ancient world had nothing to do with modern concept of nations as we intend them, right? Even if the Romans, linguistically handed down to us the term natio, right? Natio in ecclesiastical pronunciation. It's something different from today's nation states, ethnical identities, and so on. And generally speaking, a point that we make, broadly speaking, is that the same Romans made a lot of, as we will see now, a distinction between peoples like others, like the Greeks, to present something to their own community that maybe the populations that were described, they didn't even know about themselves, right? And even the most stereotypical fact of the different appearance of Romans and of this Central and Northern European populations, it was made a dichotomy. It was even recollected in the 19th century by racist, historiographers that actually caused a problem to them, because they had to justify already at that point that maybe the Romans were darker and shorter compared. How could they justify the Roman Empire and their civilization in a racist perspective? But when we look at archaeology, ethno-anthropology, anthropometrics, and so on, we realize, even linguistically, banally speaking, like the Celtic declension is dramatically similar to the second Latin one, for example, and that actually European peoples were pretty much similar to each other, much more similar to each other than it really seemed. As we were saying before, banally, within the Roman legions that invaded Gaul, there were kind of people were descending a couple of centuries before from the same Gauls, right? And it's not that the Italics, or I don't know, the Celtic Barians or the Germans. What's the difference between a Celt and a German, for example? I mean, seriously, who is the person who can actually say, this is Celtic and this is what is Celtic, what is German in the first place, right? And there's a hugely blurred area that another forgotten theater we always remember is the Danubian area. The Danubian area was heavily Celticized in some areas, and these populations were actually dramatically close to, in their traditions and warfare, to, the Dacians, other kingdoms were along the area, the Thracians. So it's actually, it's much easier, really, in a broader sense, in the ancient world, if we abandon this kind of ethnic categorization, we start reasoning mostly in terms of, something fundamentally homogeneous that eventually and epiphenomenally started to tend towards to lean towards another direction, right? And even here, there are similar processes that can be observed, broadly speaking, in the Celtic world. We'll see how, for example, the Gauls proper, the ones called like this by Caesar, so the inhabiting these tribes that went from the north western to the southeastern axis through Gaul, from Bretagne to the Alps, the Mediterranean, were substantially more advanced politically, socially speaking, than the Britons, for example, than the same Belgians, than the Germans, for sure. And this naturally brought to important changes in their military as well. That, however, just tendential, right? You can't say that a Celt that lived 30 miles away from Massilia, for example, and all the Hellenic influence that all the area had in southern Gaul, fought in a substantially different way from, a member of the Bellovaki tribe, far in the northeast of Gaul, among the Belgians. The Celts were fundamentally an homogeneous system, and homogeneous to many other tribal peoples, right? And not even talking about Europeans in general. I mean, look at what tribal warfare was in the sedentary population all across Europe, the Mediterranean, North Africa, the Near East. They were substantially the same thing, right? And the more you go back, the more primitive the societies are, actually the more similar they are in many ways, right? For example, the permanence of chariot warfare. That is typical of the most underdeveloped areas of Britain, of North Africa, right? And the rest of the world, the most advanced, had abandoned that. The Gauls, for example, had, by the time of the Roman conquest, abandoned that, right? And there were reasons, specific reasons for that. And together with that went all the, the change, even in the military culture, the warlike ethos. For example, if we refer to the immediate pre-Roman epoch, the so-called heroic ethics in the wider Celtic world survived only in Britain, right? That for this reason had specific characteristics, but that you don't find elsewhere. But for the rest was quite similar. After all, the Belgians were properly those who had invaded Britain over the centuries. In many ways, Southern Ireland, other areas around, and considered, even in this strict, that the so-called heroic fighting, in the common Homeric exception that I actually give to, that we take inspiration from, in reality, has never existed, right? As it will, happen in the Middle Ages, again, the heroes were always accompanied by a retinue, right? And the duels were the exception, not the rule, right? Also, the Hellenic Roman influences extended just a few tens of kilometers in the hinterland of the Celtic world, wherever this extended at some point, and they didn't mark the warlike traditions and habits of the Celts, right? And this is valid for the Germans, for the Dacians, for the Thracians. And it's obvious that this thing is, gradually, these peoples had also known civilization, had started importing weapons, had started, trading, had developed, complex written systems. Caesar is, refers to have found where he defeated the Helvetians, that were also, by the way, borderline Celts, as they were somewhat, mixed, like the Belgians, between the Celts and the Germans. Again, whatever that meant, that since, as you know the story, that they started migrating from roughly to today's Switzerland into the Gallic heartland, scaring all the others because they were very warlike. The Romans defeat them, and they had made when the Romans conquered their stuff, their train, and all their possessions, they find tablets written in Greek, right? Greek characters that listed basically all the possessions that these peoples on the move began to, had brought with them. And this is already a very important aspect of the story. Most of these peoples were still semi-nomadic, right? By the 1st century BC, but most of the Celtic expansion had ceased, right? This thing had gone in waves. The thing had started, from the during the 4th to 3rd century BC, mostly. Then eventually, these peoples settled down. They also naturally mixed increasingly with the local populations. They abandoned that fierce, radically, and extremely violent, habit that you find among these populated, mostly, among the Germans. There are even more primitive people that, when they finally settle down in a fertile area that can support the demographic expansion, they obviously lose part of their, warlike spirit, nature, and they can't. They obviously can do more with less effort, in a sense, and develop in turn. And in fact, the whole point of the commentary, the Bello Gallico, is to show also a certain unity of the Gallic world, right? Greek and Roman sources, after all, talk in a kind of a, even in different terms, of this entity of the Gauls that somewhat can be felt as, a collection of powerful tribes, right, that had something in common after all, but that otherwise were politically fragmented, right, and could be picked off one by one. This is what the Romans did, and already the picture of such a big chunk of Europe, like Gaul, being conquered by the Romans in only 8 years, surely, of constant campaigns, also with setbacks, with entire Roman legions wiped out, and so on. But 8 years to subdue a major continental European region, right? It surely doesn't speak for much of the cohesion of this population, which is, after all, what made the difference, right? If you really want, even there is this idea that the Gauls were so much more developed than the Germans, for example. It is true. Like this can be extended to the, broadly speaking, to the whole Celtic world. Also, Britain, for example, displayed some traits of, think about the Oppida, this Celtic fortress settlements that had emerged with trade, with the Celtic crafts. Think about metallurgy and this broader international exchanges, right? There is all the clichés also repeated by the Romans that, for example, the populations like the Belgians and the Helvetians, for example, that had remained a bit more primitive but still more cohesive, despised the Gauls, because they preferred to be considered Germans in that sense, because according to them the Gauls had lost their warlike nature. They had softened up with the luxury of the Mediterranean wealth, trade, and abandoned their warlike characters. And indeed, the Helvetians were actually defeated by the Romans with embarrassing ease. The Belgians were much tougher nut to crack. They actually were the toughest, surely the toughest Gallic tribe, or better set of tribes, because there were actually many of them, and they were among the fiercest of the whole Celtic world in general, right? Unfortunately for other Celts, not everybody was conquered by not just a military, but also a literary talent like Caesar, right? So we could have known much more about the Pannonians or the Scorched or the northern Iberian tribes, etc., in similar terms, but those were wiped out in different, actually not in very far away moments, but still not with the same amount of documentation. We could have find that's warlike cohesion in there, right? The conquest Pannonian Basin and northern Iberia required the commitment of tens of imperial Roman legions, right? And that's no joke. And once again, I don't want to extend too much in the history of the Roman conquest of Gaul, but it's obvious that most of today's information comes from there, so a bit of context is also necessary. So to make a long story short, Gaul, a rich area, right? Eventually, as you know, Gaul will become one of the greatest success of Romanization. It was an area that could provide already the basis for something more developed to happen. It was very rich, agriculturally speaking. Different from Germany, that was kind of a wasteland of swamps and forests. Many people said, no, that's a Tacitus propaganda of the senators that didn't want to invest money to invade, to basically to include other populations in the Senate. So they were saying that in Germany there wasn't nothing, etc. I beg to differ. I actually believed that where in another, of course, the Germans and the German lands more than else were way more complicated to subdue. In the first place, that the Romans tried, they actually succeeded in conquering, but you know how it ended anyway. And Gaul didn't, right? There were revolts afterwards, but eventually they were crushed. The Gauls were one of the most important elements in the Roman military in the first centuries of the empire. They were a success of Romanization, as it's witnessed in France by some of the most beautiful monuments, remains of Roman civilization. And so on. Paradoxically, their development, their road system, their citadels that were facilitated the Roman conquest. After all, Gaul, with all these, specific centers that are in today's France, essentially, aside from Paris, that has, the nation state has swallowed everything since the time of Louis XIV. So Paris and basically Lyon or Marseille, maybe a bit were the greatest centers, but Lugdunum, in fact, being actually a more important city of Lutetia, Parisiorum. But you can easily see, if you take a map of France, all these the cities are very well distributed. There are all those main road axes, that's all Roman, but actually Celtic legacy, right? So it was a very easy way to subdue. Once you crushed that center, you could control it. They were all connected by fine roads. The populations gravitated around the center, so it was very easy to maintain, right? That's something that in other Central European areas you didn't have at all, right? Germany wasn't like that at all, for example. And this is witnessed also actually by other Celtic lands, especially along the Danube, that differently from Gaul remained fundamentally just a military frontier, right? They didn't see much of a civil development. Think about the Pannonian era, right? It's not that it's so this dramatic success in Romanization. It was somewhat superficial. But aside from this, that's the point, politically fragmented and substantially rich, right? That's the best prey for every invader, for every conqueror, right? And we know the Romans were always knocking at the next person's door and assimilating it, let's say, in their empire. And the history of Roman conquest is dramatic, also because Caesar wants to show essentially that Gaul was starting to form kind of a civilization on its own. It's a big word, but the idea that larger combinations were starting to form, right? You know that the Gauls, after all, were in contact with Rome since a long time. The Aedui, or Edui, if you prefer an ecclesiastical pronunciation, were the main allies of Rome. In the heartland of Gaul, they felt as the most advanced range, and that it was the Arvernian League that was somewhat is opposing to were all the surrounding populations that also lived substantially detached or in other circuits, the forces that Gaul could field, however, if anything, from a demographical point of view, and therefore numerically in their armies, were definitely very large, right? Caesar probably exaggerates most of his numbers, right, when he speaks of, for example, Vercingetorix to have scraped together 8,000 cavalry and 250,000 foot, right? There's no army at the time that surpasses 50,000, right? And you will surely not find it in this in these populations that couldn't even keep an army together. Consider that these were all different. Like, yeah, you know what Vercingetorix means. It's not that he was called like that. These were appointments, like nicknames that were attached to Ver Kingetos Rix, which in Celtic means Ver is the great, Kingetos, it's the soldiers, and Rix is, like in Latin, it's the king, right? Rex. And that's what it means. We don't even know who he was, banally, in this sense. And he surely was a great leader, a greatly capable one, and provided with charisma, and especially the warlike culture of the Celts was definitely an important element in absence of a properly centralized power that could impose its own authority with other qualities. But these armies were sometimes, the average Gallic army were groups, let's say, of sometimes 10, 20 warriors from a band, or maybe for a tribe that could even they were gathering for the occasion. They had a scarce training, right? A minimal knowledge and trust among the leaders, right? And this is not actually a good thing, because if you have to manage hundreds of these groups that do not have much in common with each other, where's the chain of command? Where's tactics? Where's the possibility of holding all these peoples together? So no doubt about the resources of Gaul, but we're still talking about peoples that hadn't achieved anything like, let's say, a statal reality. They had their own magistrates. This is the term the Romans used to identify in their own lexicon what was going on. And there were surely a civil development and administrative, certain functions that were evidently being developed in a more civil rather than strictly military sense. There was, however, always part of the political deal after all, especially for this properly Gallic, that is central and southern Gallic tribes that were better off, they were wealthier, they were more inserted into the Mediterranean trade circuits, they simply managed more wealth, right? And however, consequently also had a more stratified society, which meant that the elite was, increasingly finer in military terms, but the rest of the freemen that, in the the height of Celtic invasions were fundamentally considered the bulk of the Celtic military force, were essentially poor in many ways. But this is true in general since the early Indo-European migrations into Gaul. Like the Gaul was already a developed area that, in this sense, we see it also from Gallic religion, that that there were these pre-Celtic, pre-Indo-European elements that had their own greater importance. They were generally more peaceful societies. It's not that they were actually, they didn't make war and anything. They were tribal, violent as much as they could be, but they were simply, as we've seen, they had less impetus than the guys come from the steppes of the Ukraine, of the Caucasus, freshly from one of the most radically violent military cultures of the steppes, right? So there was already like a more civil, asset in Gaul that entailed, however, that the average, let's make an approximation in here. The average Arvernian Gaul was essentially a fairly peaceful farmer, right? Whereas if you take the average Brigantian, Briton, for example, well, he was probably more like into raiding, small-scale warfare in this way. I mean, they had less, right? They were more voted, especially, if you make war continuously, it's not because they are, kind of more warlike by nature for some reason, hidden reason, right, behind that. It's simply because you don't have better means to survive. That's basically it, right? It's not a deep culture. Culture follows that, because those peoples eventually develop a warlike ethos and so on. But fundamentally, if you need to kill or get killed in order to survive, chances are you don't live in a very florid society. And that's, generally speaking, what we have to take into account, even when we talk about the Central European populations, realizing that, that they displayed this great, especially individual skill. Surely that was in tribal warfare a real thing. Right, but in terms of absolute military quality, well, you can be individually skilled as much as you want, but that's just a declaration of not much of a collective skill. That is what more concretely makes a military quality, right? And if you wonder why the Romans won over these populations, well, it should be pretty evident, right? Organization, discipline, collective training given by a state, these populations were just dreaming of. Right, so I don't know. I talk to an audience now. This is how much we've surpassed now the 2,000. I don't know. This thing will be listened further by people, but I presume that you do understand that there is an enormous divide between these two models of society. That that being more warlike at an individual level is not the indicator of a greatly dynamic political social strength. In general, right? Because you are in that way exactly because you can't afford the other thing, which is what civilizations do, like an empire like the Roman one and many others that had already showed the way in this sense, right? The Romans did the same thing up to 300 years before. So this is very important also to bear in mind that the Romans did share a lot, actually, even with these military cultures, and in fact were much more appreciative, say, than the Greeks that had a much more exclusivistic and fundamentally xenophobic idea. Instead, the Romans were, ethnographically speaking, much more open. They were very interested in the Gauls, in the Germans, because they recognized that there was something, that after all positive about that, myth of the good savage that were used even in their own times to describe a situation, however, that was dramatically better than these populations lived in, and that after all, the big discriminant here between the the military qualities of these populations, in fact, is not much the level of development after all. That's the point we're trying to make at the beginning. If you compare the Gauls, the Belgians, the Britons, the Germans, you see in there that there are substantial differences, right, in terms, the Gauls were, as we've seen, more advanced, say that the Suebi or others. But such a difference wasn't so great, right, as much as the level of political cohesion that these peoples had. Why were the Belgians stronger than the other Gauls? Why were the Helvetians, right? Why were the Germans, that namely is the reason why the Romans invaded Gaul, that is to prevent what had begun as a Suebic invasion of Gaul, right? That eventually the Romans took as an excuse to take over the whole Gaul, but that's, ask Caesar, not me. And that makes you really understand what it means. That is political cohesion, not specific tactics or equipment that makes the difference, right? The Celts were, more metallurgically advanced than the Germans, right? That were, barely entering. The Germans by this time were essentially prehistorical people, literally and seriously, and objectively from a historical point of view. Still, it doesn't matter. They would crush the Gauls, right? If the Romans hadn't come. Why? Because after all, those differences may have been important in the ancient world, but after all, in absolute terms, they're not this much, right? In absolute terms, the least militarily qualitative Celtic people were the Britons. In absolute terms, those were kind of the looser, more primitive Celtic reality in many ways. Like the Belgians had been kept, in shape also by this, consistent threat of, Germanic expansion. There was also this fact, how warlike are also your enemy, what you have to do to survive. But it was combined also with this broader kind of Celtic organization and, know-how and etc. But once again, let's not stress excessively these differences. Just bear in mind, however, that there are these shades and should be used as a pattern of interpretation. So historically speaking, the Celtic armies were, like most of the ones of the sedentary ancient world, were composed by an overwhelming amount of infantry over cavalry. Right, tribes could field normally like 10,000 infantry and several hundred cavalry, right? And of course, in this ancient world, infantry had the upper hand, right? We're not in the 13th century, it's the other way around. Infantry was the most important element of the army. The proportions naturally could vary wildly, though. For example, the Nervi, that were a Belgian people, used next to no cavalry, seemingly. Right, and did most of their fighting in heavily wooded areas, right, frequently plashing wood edges to form an obstacle by intertwining branches of scrub and so on. This was very common, actually. Many other peoples, the Germans did the same. In fact, they had a few cavalry on their own. And even in here, is it true that the Nervi actually didn't have cavalry at all, like the sources say? The point is that here there is a single source that states that, and basically that's what we have to go with, historiographically speaking, because literally we have no other information whatsoever. Archaeologically speaking, I think we're pretty sure that the area inhabited by the Nervi surely has, cavalry tombs. That we have a pretty, why wouldn't they use that, right? We don't have to be dogmatic about it. Next to the Nervi, there were the Remi, for example. They had allegedly the strongest Belgian cavalry, right? This is often associated also for the Treveri, that were etymologically speaking, the name of the tribe is this Celto-Germanic, as it seems, living in fact across the river, and that were some of the finest cavalry, in fact, in the area, that would also be hired by the Romans as mercenaries. So there were naturally tribes that had gained a name for this or that, like having very good cavalry or very good infantry, and this was a way of saying, but it naturally varied, right? The Israelis, of course, had both the arms and employed them. It's just that for some reason it was political and social alike, or maybe environmental, depending on where they lived. There might be some minor changes, but after all, we shouldn't extremize them, right? The Belgians, for example, overall seem to have had this dramatically powerful infantry, right? Belgian infantry was feared, generally speaking, more than the others. The wealthier Gauls in the south had more cavalry, quantitatively speaking, but as we'll see now, it's another stereotype that is very widespread and is kept being repeated over and over again, also for fanboyistic reason. It's as if the Gauls had actually a strong cavalry. Cavalry was very important in Gallic culture, right? The Gauls were very fond about horses, and they especially paid a lot for having good mounts, etc. But we have to understand that it was mostly the product of a more stratified society where the aristocracy was wealthier than the rest of the people, and generally speaking, they had also a lot of clients. They could, breed horses on a larger scale, and therefore they could deploy a lot of cavalry. But we have to say that, of course, that is not something indifferent. It's not that this cavalry was garbage, right? But without the collective discipline of a centralized state, without collective training, their quality was generally scarce, right? Consider also that at the time, and the idea that this, we had a horse, apt horse to fought on horseback, but it didn't make it a matter of principle. On the contrary, fighting on foot in antiquity, it was, almost everywhere considered more noble and courageous than fighting on horseback, right? Because on horseback you can obviously more easily flee, right? And we have an extensive knowledge about this in the area for centuries, right? It was a political thing, right? The idea is that, the people, the freemen, generally speaking, largely fighting on foot because they couldn't afford a horse, or maybe actually knew how to ride one, even pretty well, but they would preferably fight on foot because they couldn't afford it in the long run. Also, in the expeditions, think about the enormous logistical costs that, these societies didn't have much of the structures, to maintain efficient on the field, and reason for which also they were kind of putting all this great emphasis on the charge, as we'll see. That's all connected to the broader background. Would tell their aristocrats that came instead on the battlefield on horseback to dismount, right? Because otherwise they would have not fought, or better, they would have used their spears against their cavalry, and they were more than them. Infantry were stronger, and that was really a big deal for the development of their society. So the aristocrats, by ethos, like a true loyal traditional aristocrat, would naturally dismount to fight on foot. How? You fight on foot, facing the enemy and fighting him face to face, hand to hand. That's how a true warrior, true man fights, right? And naturally, the Gauls did fight in this way, and there were lots of good infantries that, as we will see now, were developing. Also, not much in a properly Gallic environment, but as Gauls that went abroad, actually selling their services as professionals that, ironically, were more often to be found, in fact, in foreign use than in the same Gaul. But Gaul starts producing something that, for example, the Belgians or the Britons didn't quite display in the same measure. That is, this professional bands of warrior, right? The idea of transition, of how a civilization evolves from a seasonal warfare where, the guy literally, just goes out there and campaign for a few weeks and then comes back in time for the harvest. Here instead you have full-time, lifetime professionals that basically just live for the sake of warfare in a market of war that now exists, right? And with the rest of freemen that basically cannot compete by experience, by cost of equipment, it's anymore much, and that largely actually maintain these people, because most of the times, at least in a domestic context, these are the bodyguards, the retinues, as we will see, the solduri, as they were called, the devoted ones, were a chieftain retinue paid by the farmers, by the peasantry that worked for them, right? Many people stress also the development in Celtic and more specifically Gallic, because this is probably a Gallic thing, the thing of cavalry. You don't find much of a deal of cavalry in other Celtic peoples, after all, more than others. Like, the Iberians easily had better cavalries. There were all different, specialties even in that regard. But the fact that there is probably a Celtic legacy in the figure of the medieval knight because of this Gallic, aristocratic clienteles of sort. Is it true? Well, consider that Gaul has reigned for half of a millennium under the Roman Empire, and it's surely, if there is a legacy of that kind, it's largely also the one of the Gallo-Roman senators that had fundamentally become the ones that eventually would mix with the Franks in the Merovingian times, would give birth. Why not? Yes, but that wasn't just. It was a broader kind of tribal, let's say, ancestral Indo-European and more generally and more universally tribal legacy that had remained. And this idea that the aristocrat was the cooler guy that had, after all, not much because of his wealth, it was deserved, right? But probably because of the glory, of the product of his force, of his strength, of his value, of his virtue, that had been given by the gods the right to vanquish and to use that power, even for having better equipment, horse, and really distinguishing from the rest of the masses. Yes, but always keep in mind in this regard that still the toughest Gauls, as we've seen with the Belgians, were not the Gauls, were not the ones where cavalry was more developed, were the ones that had this extremely strong infantry, strong as we'll see now, but were capable of achieving even just physical feats that speak about that individual, quality we're talking about before, were utterly astonishing, right? The Battle of the Sambre River, ask the Romans of the 9th and 10th Legion what they saw those Belgians doing in front of their eyes. Because that's wild, that's sick, right? That's something that if you're not a person that has been fighting for his own life, has a certain degree of physicality, and mindset, pushed at the limit, you can't really achieve, right? And that a Roman legionnaire didn't quite have in the same way, right? But collective training, discipline, etc., won over that quality, right? Barely, by the way, because the Battle of Sambre River was almost a Roman defeat, and after all, the Romans were defeated by the Gauls still by the time of Caesar. So that's very important to stress also that in terms of in those homogeneous terms we were talking about in the beginning, that there is not a dramatic asymmetry in absolute terms between, I don't know, a Roman legion and a Celtic army, right? Of course, for ancient times, the difference was an enormous deal. But still, right, it was pretty even, right? It wasn't, not even the Roman legionnaire was devoid of the tribal, individualistic, we have stressed, we've talked about this in videos we made about Roman warfare. There was much of that warlike element still in the Roman legionnaire, that was the same of the Gauls. After all, if you look at the Gauls in Italy, the Italic warriors in Italy, they fought basically in the same way originally, and that was a few centuries before. They had the same identical equipment, right? In terms of, fencing, the swords of the same length, spears of the same length with its broad tips that suggest a very individualistic fencing. Now time had passed, things had gone for the Romans dramatically more ahead in terms of military development and sophistication, but still the core of what makes the difference on the field sometimes is due also to such aspects that, after all, in the case of the Roman legionnaire, made also its success over other tactical, soldier models, individual models. As we've seen with the Nervi, this idea of ambushing, however, was pretty much standard among these people, especially when, for the Celts, said many times, whenever they saw a greater resistance on the field by this more, professional drilled systems, they tended to simply to retreat, right? Because they couldn't hold properly. As we were hinting at before, it's really a broader logistical problem. It's the idea that it was already a big deal to gather all of these troops in a single place for political reasons, to feed them, to make them drink, and therefore even the fight was aimed at giving all the energies out first with a massive charge, because there was no way to recover afterwards. There was no way to rely on a longer run on supplies, of maintaining greater cohesion. So this influenced tactics heavily, and as you know, for example, thinking about Ambiorix, and his Belgian ambush that destroyed a couple of Roman legions, actually almost to one, and some other cohort, were the only way of defeating the Romans in open field, without greater masses of troops gathered and that could overwhelm them just with the numbers, right? This is very important, because there is nothing properly covered in this. War is asymmetrical by definition. If you hadn't ambushed the Romans, you would have, Armenians would have not gotten rid of them in Germany. These peoples here would have not hoped to survive as an independent reality. So that's how wars are fought normally, right? And this only shows that objectively in open field that there wasn't much that these military systems could do against the legions, right? And this was pretty much widespread, right? As much as, in fact, there are cultural divides in here, because when the Romans invade Gaul, this is a bit the leitmotif of the Gallic War. The Gauls decide to face the Romans, right? In open field, because that's what a true warrior does. They get annihilated. So the only one that starts carrying out instead a scorched heart strategy, that intelligently enough, because Caesar was dramatically short of resources and supplies, was Vercingetorix, or Vercingetorix, say better, that starts doing that, wears Caesar out. For this region, manages to defeat him at Gergovia. He doesn't follow up, that, because Caesar could be wiped out completely on that occasion. And the only thing he does is, pointing on this last great battle at Alesia, gathering, having to face at that point the Romans, not even properly in a pitched battle, but actually assaulting the fortification they had built around Alesia during the siege, and therefore gathering this immense force from all of Gaul, right? That is the symbol of what theoretically the Gauls might have been capable of had they been united. In actual terms, maybe if the Gauls would have won on the longer run, the Romans would have reacquired, would have conquered Gaul anyway, because there was simply no comparison in terms of economical, demographic resources. It wasn't considered, but we could presume that a Vercingetorix victory on Caesar might have given rise to something more, unitary, something more centrally administered, even in terms of the armies. Kind of a greater levy participation, right? Even to curb, it was the deal of a monarchy after all, curbing the nobility to favoring the people and remaining the overrule. We don't know, but still we have to acknowledge the relatively limited systemic capability of these tribes to hold for a longer run, considering the Gauls had suffered the Teutonic migrations all over the Teutons had migrated from the Jutland Peninsula. They had gone first to the Noricum, roughly today's Austria, then they had passed in northern Italy, ravaging, they arrived up to northern Spain, then they come back to Gaul. From Gaul, they ravage Gaul, and the Gauls don't know how to deal with these people, because those are tough guys. They come from that Germanic context in the Jutland. Surely was some Celtic element within it for sure, but from a dramatically more cohesive and courageous and primitive and warlike context for which this military system is, the Gauls can't really put up with, right? And Gaul had been shattered, had been ravaged, and eventually the Romans defeated the Teutons and the Cimbri. But in southern Gaul, But the think about, even internationally speaking, how the intrinsic fragility of Gaul had been exposed in that sense, right? That's very important to stress. Also consider the Roman victories during the Gallic War over the Germans, right, that were depicted as this dramatic threat for Gaul and were objectively, expanding in it, and that, if those were feared by the Gauls, and Caesar basically defeated them, destroyed Ariovistus' army, entered Germany, slaughtered a couple of tribes, makes, a wasteland, and comes back over the Rhine, astonishing the Germans that had never seen anything like, the bridge that the Romans built over the Rhine, and that fundamentally, in fact, wouldn't interfere with Gaul anymore in that sense, right? It was a dramatic, deterrent success of the Romans, of Caesar. The same goes with Britain, right? It's ridiculous when you hear those things like, Caesar invaded Britain, but he didn't conquer it, right? Because the Britons were, cool, was strong. No, Caesar went there just to show these people that they didn't have to mess with the Romans in Gaul, whatever happened, which is what punctually didn't happen, right? Because the Britons freaked out and remained loyal to Rome substantially up to Claudius times, Caligula's times, and they were pretty easily subdued, as you know, in the same way. So actually, all the Bello Gallico is a counterinsurgency manual, right, that shows a complete success fundamentally, not just in Gaul, but in Britain and in Germany as well. And I promise we will expand on this topic, because it's one of those things that you really can't do without if you want to have a minimal, intro to ancient military history. But the substance of these strength ratios is fundamentally the single most important thing to understand in this picture. Right, if you start making a point on these were cooler, these were, according to me, they were super advanced, there's all a conspiracy behind Roman historiography, this is not true, we want to be concealed, all these voices, rumors, etc. It's because you can't substantiate what we actually know, historically speaking, not just for whatever Caesar wrote that is dramatically coherent and logical and in line with everything else we know about the ancient world, those specific realities. I don't know what to tell you. That's where at the beginning, I can't be harsh in stating that this is a problem, but I care a lot, because it's not a matter of detail, right? It's a matter of substance, right? If you deny that, you deny the substance of the whole historical essence, and you can't approach history like that. So as we were talking about before, cavalry was a big deal among the Gauls. Leaders and the richer men especially were providing also this, larger equipments, iron mail, right? This idea that the iron mail was associated mostly to cavalry is not quite correct, right? As we were saying before, even distinguishing much between and dismounted troops, as we've seen, doesn't make quite a lot of sense, right? And actually, would have been better for these troops to be on foot, right? To be more resistant, after all, more effective, more spendable in battle than on horseback. But of course, there was this broader capability of fielding good, well-armored troops. I think most Gallic riders would have worn at least a metal helmet, and that's not also what makes the enormous difference, as we've seen, but actually how cohesive and how close-knit that unit is. And as we have seen, these systems couldn't make miracles, right? The rumor that Gallic cavalry was so strong is actually about the numbers, right? The Romans found themselves often, outnumbered in cavalry when facing Gallic armies. This is something that dates back to, much before, right? And the Romans and the Gauls had, pretty strained relations, albeit not broadly meant, right? There was all. Now, let's not digress on the Roman sagas and the figure of the Gaul and so on, but there was, even as we can see, actually a similarity in many ways, right? It's a myth that Roman cavalry was scarce, for example, and this is often confused, in fact, exactly with numbers, right? That's the strength that the Gauls had in their cavalry, not much in their quality after all. And Gallic cavalry was actually good as others, right? You can't say, I don't know, the Dacians didn't have good cavalry, or the Barons didn't have good. Actually, the Barons were more famous for that. The Germans seemingly had actually less cavalry, but they had a higher moral over the Gauls most of the times. That their German horses, for example, were smaller and uglier, as Caesar or Tacitus, I don't remember, puts that. And in fact, Caesar gives to the German mercenary cavalry the Roman equites mounts, so that they could fight better with Gauls. So stressing the fact that, after all, as we were saying before, it's not much the broad organization, these peoples that differed, but mostly their impetus, their moral, right? And the Germans, in fact, German cavalry helped to defeat the Gauls, right? And the Germans had traditionally less consistent cavalry than the Gauls, and they managed to defeat them as well, right? So that tells you how the difference was loose after all, and how the moral dimension, as always, Clausewitzian terms, is the one that makes the difference, right? The Germans were more warlike in this regard. As many other peoples, the Gauls practiced a variety of evolutions on horseback. Their normal attack being a partial charge, throwing javelins, then turning or wheeling away if the enemy were not impressed, or charging home with spear or sword if they were disordered or shaken. This is pretty standard tactics of the time. Gallic cavalry would have substantial shields, apparently be armed with javelins, light spears, and cutting swords. Cavalry swords said to be better than ones of some of the infantry, at least. These distinctions are quite wargamistic and properly do not make much sense, right? As we will see now also about the quality of the swords, there is a bit of a discussion about it, but it's simpler than it seems. The infantry, the Gallic infantry, were provided by the lower classes. It could be general levies or entire tribes, and in here there is all the idea of of the comitatus and the village, let's say, that in these tribal societies there were tendentially two types of warriors. The ones that properly actually were sent out, right, because there were too many, this young, sexually active, mature men that would, be essentially gotten away because there wasn't enough space for the community to sustain them, and their violence, their impetus was sent out there to ravage, to pillage, to rape, to enslave, to conquer, right? And that's what all tribal peoples had been about, as the same had been for the Romans in the past, and these tribes were fundamentally devotional brotherhoods of warriors that were very often voted to these warlike deities that fundamentally possessed their soul and made them devoted to death up to a certain point, so that their life, once entered the brotherhood through a very harsh passage ritual, didn't belong to them anymore, so much that allegedly, every once in a while, one of them was picked, maybe the one that was late for the meeting, and slaughtered in front of everybody, because making a human sacrifice for the deity, because he had not been fit for the task. That's how they basically devastated and traumatized this psychologically these people, at the point that they would be totally obedient for that. We will see it for the Gaisati, especially, that were capable even just of throwing themselves to death, right? And these were the toughest guys, the ones that were fundamentally hired, the ones that carried out most of the Celtic, they were the spearhead, at least, of the Celtic migration. The Celtic migration included entire peoples, like it would be for the Germans later. But generally speaking, there were these bands at a certain point kept selling their services, having earned military experiences, where Celtic mercenaries were famous all over the Mediterranean, were employed by the Romans, by the Greeks, by the Carthaginians, and so on. And with the hope that one day they would settle down in a way or another, maybe start even their own entourage. Then there was the villager, the farmer that was by far the most common, especially in Gaul, as we have seen, individual that had a role in society, had a family, had a wife, had children, worked the land for their survival. So it was, right? Every once in a while, he had to take his own weapons, his own arms. He knew how to use, if anything, living in the wild, knowing how to hunt animals and men alike, and which was absolutely normal. Catching some thief, some more deer. It's not that these societies were dramatically peaceful by themselves. Even having, surely, as a non-military man to cook a warlike ethos, an idea of what the true man had to be about. What duels, judicial duels were about. Knowing how to use a weapon, and it was the normality for this person. So. By the time of the Gallic Wars, naturally, most of those huge numbers collected by Vercingetorix were mostly these levies of the lower classes, right? Who had no say in political matters, because at this point they were already under someone else, right? They were holding their land for someone, or at least having to pay definitely hush money in a way. The pre-statal world was a huge mob, a huge mafia, right? That's how it works in pre-statal reality. It's not like the mafia, it's actually mafia by definition. And these bands of thugs, they start living fundamentally, with the patina of aristocratic military attitude, but maintained fundamentally by the work of these farmers that grew demilitarized in if anything in their culture, and so on. And so these people simply did what the nobles told them to do, right? And this happened mostly, as we've seen, in most developed areas. That is not that in all Gaul this was the reality. At the fringes of Gaul, in many areas in the north or along the Alpine chains and so on, the society was much more primitive in many ways, and so the people, generally speaking, had more force because society was less stratified, and therefore the individual had still a say, but still these people were the least powerful tribes that, no surprise, had remained at the outskirts of the rest of the Gallic world, that instead was more advanced and also looked upon this villains even as with contempt, because a great Arverni or Idwe chieftain that lived his life revered, with servants, with retinues, trained in the skills of arms, and knowing how to sing all these magic rituals in the Druidic tradition, knowing the values, having a wide knowledge of the world, an astronomic knowledge, herbary knowledge, an idea of a view of nature was deep, insightful, having a wide net of relations, comparing with other nobility, far range, well, developed trade circuit that could exchange all of these, products and knowledge of the outer world, and that ruled over masses of people and was, serving, in the field for his clan, for his king as a major oligarch with all his splendor and arms and skilled in individual combat and feats and so on, with songs that were sung in his state. And one of his ancestors looked at these rags from the Alps that still fought half naked, scattered over the mountains like half animals. Of course, they treated them as what they actually were fundamentally. So these are the extremes you can find in this world. It's very fascinating, right? There is a lot about the spirituality of these peoples that was somehow all one with this military religious ideals. The Gauls made a great use of drugs, in order to have visions, to get these, to leave more, to expand their vision of the world, their perception. The Gauls, the Celts also, they bathed, they cared about their bodies. There was in fact, a spiritual and bodily culture in this regard. The famous head hunting Celtic tradition that the Greeks, the Romans, hint at, look at these barbarians that basically cut the heads and they waved them. But of course, that was done, the one of the enemies, but also sometimes it was the one of the friends, because they simply, believed that the essence, the spirit, the nobility of an enemy, and not an enemy like all the others, but usually chieftains, right? And this is what also the Romans did, believed in the head. The Romans actually had, if you think about their funerary masks, all this, they came from a not very far past, was identically the same thing, which there was probably a rite. They cut the enemy head and they sacrificed it to the altars of the gods. But equally, when a companion was slain in combat, and they in a faraway land, in a raid, in a war out there, they couldn't carry his corpse home, so they would cut his head and treat it with some oils, to preserve it, to maintain, brought home, because that was the essence of the man, of the warrior, right? And even these practices you find in other cultures of cutting the enemy head, making it taking away all the tissues and making it just a cup to drink from. It was not like an offense or something barbaric. It was actually, if you drank from the skull of a king, it's because you literally drank his own might. And it was a compliment, technically, because that was a hell of a man you had vanquished, and you had assumed his power. And this was all mixed with vision of nature, and it was actually a pretty grim one, right? It wasn't a bright positive. It was dominated by a tragic destiny of the world. It's something you find more eloquently in the Germanic tradition, but these peoples were, as we've seen, very similar actually to each other. It was a very dark, violent world, and the destiny of the warrior was the one to die next to his lord, and this was the greatest honor and prize for a Celtic warrior. So between the extremes that we've traced before, naturally there were in the middle, between the fanatic devotee warrior and the average farmer, that were, there was a halfway, right? A substantial amount of pretty good warriors, right? That were substantially the most important and dangerous part of an average Celtic army, as far as the Romans were concerned, right? That showed off, in fact, largely in the previous period, where chiefly when the Celts were on the move, and therefore they were all kind of more cohesive because of the sake of migration. They were, on average, more hungry and more realizing that a defeat would be to their hands. So also, as we've seen, poorer society, more primitive society, didn't have much of a social difference among each other. So those were the ones that had constituted the bulk of the invading Celtic armies. They were very tough nuts to crack. And the best infantrymen in general were equipped with a long, stout shield, right? It was famous out there in the Mediterranean world. It's what allegedly the Greeks took they gave the name of tureos, right? Given that the Celtic shields were usually larger in that sense, at least these broader infantry ones. They were not excessively different from the Roman scutum, albeit the scutum is properly an Italic invention, as by some says, no, that's Celtic as well. Actually not. It's not. In fact, we don't even know if the Greeks actually called it the same name, tureos, also the Roman scutum. And they, in fact, they started using the type of shield. It was, however, smaller in the Greek world, a smaller version for their own needs, exactly during the Pyrrhic Wars against the Romans and the Celtic invasion of Greece, right? It's a bit on the same time. And a bunch of javelins / spears, because that's basically what this is standard equipment of any warrior of antiquity in a sedentary world, right? A shield, bunch of javelins / spears that you can use as stopping spear as well as throwing spear, because what's a javelin after all? What's a spear after all, right? It's still a pointy stick with a or at least a stick with a kind of reinforced point of metal, and so on. And there is this idea that the average Celtic warrior had a sword as well. Swords were naturally more expensive, as you understand, and there is this idea it was designed apparently only for cutting and needing room to swing. There were actually more varieties of this, and this is a bit of a broader, assumption. The idea that the Celtic shield has been deemed in a bit of an apodictic way a shield for troops in open order, like for melee with the sword, differently from, for example, the hoplitic one that would have been useful only for troops using lances and fighting in close ranks. And actually, nobody has ever demonstrated or provided an exhaustive explanation for these that are considered actually proper and true, undebatable assumptions, right? And on the contrary, we have evidence of troops that fight even with pikes and oval shields of Celtic type, and troops that fight with javelins and hoplitic shields. This is to be found also in the Celtic world, right? The Celto-Hellenic troops, yeah, surely, why wouldn't an Arverni, or Artectos Hages chieftain use a hoplon together with his sword, right? We have set a huge amount of time that what we are equipped with doesn't necessarily correspond to a standard systemic. You don't have to fight like an hoplite just because you have a hoplon, right? And relatively to the Celts, the idea of the phalanx, right? Because this has been told many times, simply because someone found easily that in Greek, as we were saying before, Celtic heavy infantry is called phalanx. What a surprise! Every single heavy infantry was was known in Greek as phalanx, right? Then we began to historiographically call the phalanx the hoplitic classical phalanx, specifically that specific hoplitic warfare that we know actually just for Athens and Sparta, because it was an exception even within the same Greece. It was never exported with success. The Greek colonies didn't actually fight in the same way. Obviously, nor did the Celts did, but this incapability of understanding that actually fighting lined up in close array was possible also for a Celtic army, and that still doesn't mean to fight like an hoplitic phalanx at all, is somewhat hard to make people understand. Also, there is evidence, for example, of Celts that once they had launched these dreadful charges and were repelled, on many occasions, being exhausted and wanting to die with honor, they would fundamentally enclose themselves in what the Romans in Latin properly call a testudo, right? And also, what a surprise! A unit that is targeted by javelins, considered that most of ancient battles were all stuff imaginable flying over your head all the time, including Celtic warfare, and repairing themselves with shields. Right? What a surprise! Someone who has a shield and fights in a unit, like since the at that point centuries and centuries, in an orderly way, enclosing itself under shields. Wow, right? And still you will find those people that think that the testudo was just a Roman thing because the rectangular shield that they had used, in the perfect way to make the terrible tactics that actually was just defending yourself if you didn't have any other cover in an emergency situation. And by the way, the Romans did such arrangements with shields even far before the rectangular shield came about, including storming citadels, making ramps with legionnaires putting the shields on their heads and the others running over the walls, or other circus evolutions made exactly in the same way for amusing the local population where the garrison was. So people discover cold water and get amazed about, who knows what kind of true tactics did the Celts use? Maybe they were using the same Greek phalanx or the Roman testudo. No, they were just like any other people out there, using their weapons in the most obvious way you would do when you're under fire, and simply, being in closer, in open or closer array, depending simply on how you had been arranged on the battlefield, right? You don't have necessarily to. Also, the gladius was a slashing weapon. Also, we don't know what kind of distance there was actually among soldiers, not even about the Roman legion, right? We just have two information. One is from Caesar, if I'm not wrong. The other is from the Jets. They say basically the opposite thing. One is kind of an open order, almost like a phalanx. The truth, though, is that there is no thing like that was a standard order or a prearranged collective pattern which the Celts arranged their troops, right? Generalizations such as those Gauls that lived in the flatlands fought in closed order, right? Because they had to be more compact, because cavalry was more important there, right? While those of the mountainous regions fought in open or semi-closed array, are amenities devoid of any historical foundation, right? Troops were deployed in the most differing way, depending on situations that are not manufacturally related to geographical characteristics, but which, by the way, change continuously. Is there a region where it's only a huge flatland? Yeah, I know Dutch followers don't say anything, because not even in your country is actually fully like that. Especially at this time, full of swamp, filled of different realities, even forests and so on. Nor there are just mountains, right? Every army is different. Every place is different. It's way more correct military historically, to say who had more time to deploy, had more cohesive leaders, steadier men, which means better rested, nourished, or loyal to their chieftain, deployed in closed order. The others simply how they happen to be, right? That's it. There is a great variety, and mostly this depends on the political cohesion, right? On the unit cohesion, or who brings them on the field and how decides and has the possibility to arrange them in the first place. And a tighter order, a closer order, is absolutely possible to employ. Also, there is all this fact saying, the Roman threw the pila, like they could blow up, kind of the damning front line when they were charging. This is technically true. I mean, if you calculate what stereotypically fully achieved, collectively performed pilum throw with the lighter one at the beginning and the lower one at a few meters with the perfect timing and everything, you can arrive to basically cover on a shield wall in front of a shield like one pilum for 30 square centimeters, right? That is basically you destroy the cohesion of that unit even before you come to grips with it. And yet we have to acknowledge that this was not often performed. Other thing, it's not that the Romans standardly, every single time were attacked, actually mostly as they were attacked, because the only case of pila used in defense come from an account of the Gallic wars of the River Sambre, right, where the Romans were attacked by the Belgians uphill, right, and they threw it at their defense. But for the rest of the Romans threw that in a concerted fashion only during the attack. But generally speaking, battles lasted hours. So these javelins were often thrown in many other moments, right? And it was not really a standard. I mean, there is no historical evidence that Romans standardly at every attack launched a pila in that way. First. Second, the enemies were full of javelins as well, right? And that in order to tempest an enemy with javelins, you don't need to be a Roman. You just need to be an ancient warrior of any kind. And so when we think about, the Romans had an edge, yes, but consider that these guys had also certain pretty damn hard missile capabilities, especially the Gaisatae, as we will see now, that were unusually fit, and they were part of those devotees, brotherhoods that spent their entire lifetimes brutalizing and traumatizing psychophysically each other for the sake of it, and developing even a physicality was more beast-like than anything. It could throw javelins at a unusually longer distance than others. And much of the deal, naturally, of armies that feared to come to grips with better armored uniformly armored, especially units like the Roman ones would do, like to mostly hit the enemy at a distance and, softening up as much as you could before, coming at close range with him, because most Celtic warriors simply didn't have an armor, right? And there is another wargamistic prejudice that I don't know where it came from, right? And it's like this happens, one historian, one scholar writes it for the pure, for pure delirium or invention or in some way, and everybody copies that, and that becomes like a popular thing on the internet, like the fact that the Celts had allegedly a few skirmishers. I don't know who's the idiot who came up with this, frankly, and especially was the idiot who can't even think that you can actually know historically speaking. Like, when these are universally unknown topics, like even if there was an ancient source that states that, you can easily know that it's not the case, that these peoples, like all the others, had a lot of skirmishers on a regular base, right? For this age, and also before, because there is a hint, we'll talk about it later, that there were a lot of younger people, right, that skirmished as long as they could, right, with every throwing type. Other stupid stereotype, I don't know where it came from, that slings were rare among the Celts, the bow was more widespread. Where's the evidence? I mean, how can you quantify that? Just because maybe the bow appears like one and the sling is not named, and then therefore you assume that there was this disparity. What do we know? We don't know how a single army could be organized on one occasion, and the ancient authors never enter in the specifics. Archaeological finds are rare. Yes, there can be a general impression, but they're just hypotheses, right? Of course, the Celts used widely javelins, bows, slings, right? We have evidence of that. And the reason why this was done, and it was necessarily functional to those systems, is that they needed time in order to deploy. And this took time. It was not a drilled Roman legion. They arrived on the field already in that formation, knew how to do it, then deployed passed from column to line. They did it in a blink of an eye and could attack the enemy. That's one of the greatest edges of the Roman army. Nobody talks about that. Everybody's obsessed by equipment, but that's actually what collective training is about, and why these, the Celts were massacred most of the times. They didn't have time. They didn't have collective discipline. They didn't have much of an organization. So you needed to buy time by skirmishing a lot, and therefore we know for sure in this regard, even if it's hypothetical, because theoretical, let's say better, because we don't have the direct evidence, but we know it. We know it for many other peoples, right? And naturally, it was the younger people, because they're more elastic, more agile, more cut for that. The more mature guys would be the infantry. They had the stopping infantry. Stereotypically, it was for the Romans, as you well know. The same thing, at least originally. Now, by the time of Gallic wars, as you know, the Roman infantry had undergone a homogenization, but the Romans used lots of skirmishers themselves. The same legionnaires could abandon their heavier equipment and becoming assault troops. Many ways, they simply used more, specialized professionals like Balearic slingers or the Numidian cavalry men that were brought by Caesar in Gaul, for example. And so I don't know really where these prejudices, you find them quoted even in, in fact, mostly war games inspired texts for the sake of, synthesis, but, they don't even explain what was the alleged base for such statements, and generally speaking, not even why. You should point that out, right? And the quality of the swords. Other thing, some Roman historians tell us that the metal of the Celtic swords was poor quality and needed to be straightened with the foot after a few blows. Now, archaeologically, there's no find to substantiate this specifically, but it's kind of obvious that the poorer warriors had simply poorer swords. So, Celtic metallurgy, as you know, was very advanced. They had, especially the Noricum, was a very advanced area. They somewhat taught their craft to the Germans, to the Iberians, even to the Romans in many ways. But, for one extra super cool swords that a chieftain could have some other nobleman, it's obvious that the masses of other peoples had kind of cheaper stuff. Because guess what? In warfare, what really is the more spread thing is not the best thing, is the good enough thing, right? And it's obvious that especially if Celts are stereotypically pictured as swordsmen, generally, even if probably they weren't, as a matter of fact, the average would be a spearman with a shield, and not much more, especially the levies, as we have seen, with the numbers were higher. Their swords were cheaper than the best one, and the quality was. Right, and don't think even that the crafts of the time for one masterpiece that couldn't be replicated even with modern day technologies, they wouldn't make other 20 abortions. And this is normal in artisan craft, right? So this is kind of obvious statements, but apparently there are people who could stab each other still saying, the Romans said, the sword band and this, no, the archaeological thing. It's that simple as, there are different types of swords and most of them are kind of cheaper. What is there to understand? It happens in every kind of military context. There is nothing to understand about it. It's perfectly self-evident. Other aspect, we know of the Helvetians and the Galatians that are sometimes said to have had this closer arrays, right? But as we explained before, this is fully possible, right? Especially considering that these were the Galatians are probably overestimated. The Helvetians probably not, even though they were, as we were saying before, defeated incredibly easily by the Romans. But that's another story. But having a greater cohesion, it's possible that also their general military organization was somewhat better, and that such an array was, on average, more common. It's possible. Other aspect that the Roman historiographers indulge, including Caesar, about the idea that the Gauls were bigger than the Romans, right? It's the Romans that say that. Why would they say that? Well, from one thing, was an average Gaul taller than an average Roman legionnaire? It's difficult to say, really difficult to say, because you see, here we already made a distinction that is the average Gaul with the average Roman legionnaire. At the time of Caesar, the limit of legionary recruiting was 5 feet and 8 inches, right? So intrinsically, in the Bello Gallico, Caesar talks about the legionnaires. So this, in practice, would mean that many Gauls would have been over 6 feet. Is it possible? Yes, why not? Right? We know that these peoples had, eventually, to evolve the societies in tougher situations. So the climate differences at the times were much more felt. It would be in more advanced times. So there were tougher environments to survive. Generally speaking, the larger people would tend to survive. That's the reason why, generally speaking, Northern Europeans are taller than Southern Europeans. But even in here, the anthropometric measurements do not suggest it was a dramatic difference. That there were, a few inches, after all, in difference. And considering, as well, as we were saying before, that many legionnaires at that time even descended from Gauls. But the reason why Roman sources stress this difference was to highlight the moral superiority of the Romans, right? They were basically mocking the Gauls at many occasions in the Bello Gallico. There was one particular, I remember which city, that, the Gauls from the walls of the city from which they felt so secure, they had all this long blonde hair, and they mocked the Romans because they looked at them and they were short and dark. And then they were laughing from the city walls, and until they started seeing that the Romans started building siege towers that they had apparently never seen built in that speed and in that fashion. And when they saw that, they stopped laughing. End of story. They had to hand over all the weapons to the Romans before handing over the city. Then the Romans entered the city and found kind of like twice as weapons that had been stored there. And that's, the idea of the beauty, the physical beauty, the physical prowess. This is something that in ancient tribal societies is very important. Like the warrior doesn't have to be just valorous, courageous, to speak truthfully, to be responsible about his action, to be strong. He has to be good looking, to be properly beautiful. This is something that survived even in modern chivalry. The idea that when the German and Polish knights faced the Mongols in open field, their deal was they had to be beautiful. They had to show this long blonde hair in front of the Mongolian. The Mongolian commander was kind of an obese guy that had to be carried on with a wagon on the field. Guess how it ended? Just for the sake of the difference between collective discipline and individual battle. That at the end of the battle, the Mongols collected entire sacks of cut off ears from all the European knights that had slaughtered. So beauty, perfectly useless quality, in part in the sense that for those systems it was important evidently to be fit, to be beautiful in the sense of being healthy, of being a figure that could not be object of mockery, that could give that confidence that for whichever evolutionary reason makes us feel uncomfortable with ugliness, and it's written in our genes. There's nothing we can do with that. Is important to give the warrior even that psychological edge of even a prevarication. It is to say, I'm stronger, more beautiful, I smash you because I'm superior to you, right? It was almost an ethnic contempt, right? If you wonder where even the aristocratic contempt towards the peasantry came from, the idea of the pure blood, all this stuff was partially in this way, right? The idea that the stronger had to rule, it's something that was somewhat innate in these populations, and it was brutal, as you understand, and as disturbing as it can, but don't think that the other peoples were different from that, or that the Romans actually were kind of singing themselves to be, oh, look at us, we are so dark and so sharp, as if they were, by the way, because the Romans weren't actually that the stereotypical picture, as we were saying at the beginning. Actually, Europeans look dramatically similar in many ways, and there is the need to emphasize this difference for showing what here the Roman can do against someone that counts on something just like beauty and is not even capable of creating a siege engine to smash the greatest defenses that they could ever conceive in that culture, right? And that's something that will remain as an ethnographical cliche in Roman history. As we were saying before, it's being collected by kind of racist ethnographers to stress this idea that and even today among ethno-nationalists there is this dramatic physical divide among northern and southern Europeans, which actually it's not really the case on average. And the point here is to really stress, however, also a kind of beast-like appearance of the Gauls, of the Germans, of these peoples that after all looked in fact similar in this description, because in fact they were, even just ethnically speaking. But if you consider even just the distance between Gaul and Italy, I mean, how do you think these people differed actually, ethnically? Right? They were next door to each other, right? Hell, there were Gauls in northern Italy, up to central Italy too. So it's the cliche, inflated to give the sense of, we are these guys here and you are those guys there, and we break your, wall. And anyway, in spite of your, kind of traditions, your ideals, and so on. And this is actually also a very crude ideal by itself, but it shows the power of civilization, something that, in fact, ethno-nationalists, when studying these histories, do not like quite much, and need to blame, the Romans for being, I don't know, the Nazis of the ancient world that destroys this other pure, this society. Those peoples weren't any better, right? They slaughtered, raped, enslaved each other on a regular basis, simply on a smaller scale. The only difference with the Romans is that the Romans knew how to do it better, because they were freaking more advanced. And as we have always seen, also with von Clausewitz and so on, the degree of destructiveness does not decrease with the development of civilization. It goes in parallel. The more civilized you are, the more destructive you are. And this is a lesson that we have to learn from history, because denying it means to deresponsibilize yourself from a political point of view, from a civil point of view, right? If you don't know what civilization is capable of doing, then you're a danger for that same civilization. There are many other, I'm thinking of all other episodes of the Bello Gallico that would deserve a digression, but maybe we will do it in another video, because they're fun in this regard. For example, about this stature of the war, there is that episode before the Suebi of Ariovistus arrived to Gaul, and the Romans defeat them, that the Gauls had told to the Romans that the Germans were giants, right? You know, the fact that the Romans had remained somewhat traumatized by the idea of the Teutons had become somewhat this idea of this terrible giant blonde monsters come from the far north that wanted to eat it. So allegedly, according to Caesar, you know, all the legionnaires, you know, that had talked, because this happened in Gaul, right? You know, so the Gauls that were allied with Rome told them about the Germans, and this Roman legionnaires that were to fight with the Germans in a few times started to lament themselves, to write testaments and things like this. So Caesar calls all the centurions and starts telling them that his soldiers should not behave like cowards, and that, you know, think that the Romans had already crushed the Germans, that, you know, these were just, you know, that they had just defeated the Albatians, would seem who knows what, and they were kind of close. The Gauls were all scared by them, and the Romans had wiped them out in the blink of an eye, and that were closer to the Germans. And of course, if the Romans fight against the Germans and win brutally, and that's also another way to say, to emphasize that stereotype of the fact that even for the Gauls, eventually the Germans were giants, right? So, but in fact, we know that they looked pretty similar. So it's obviously a literary, an ethnographical topos, an expedient to make the story, but we shouldn't overly emphasize this aspect, because it's not even important. Naturally, the physicality, I mean, being taller is, you know, being larger is generally speaking important. And this, as we have seen before, these military cultures invested much of their, you know, tactical dynamics on this first great charge, right? So the idea of being beefy, very big, muscular, and so that you can spend your energies all in a blow with devastating force, and eventually, however, not being very resilient, is probably true. Like the physicalities of a Gallic warrior and of a Roman legionnaire could differ in that measure, right? Always given that we perfectly know that just like a part of those, you know, military bands / semi-professional bands would have that kind of physicality in the Gallic world. The average Gallic levy was just these guys working in Iron Age farms with not much of any training, or, you know, at a level of survival rate, and we perfectly know what those people look like in reality in many parts of the world, and they're absolutely not very apt to fight at all. Roman legionnaires, on the contrary, would be very well drilled, very well fit for individual combat, but in the logic of formation, right, of unit combat most. But they would do their job also in individual fight. Always given that the Gauls, in this sense, probably had, can say necessarily, always a superior value, individually speaking. Right? It's obvious that if Vercingetorix, there was a great nobleman, so one of the most dramatically trained and individually skilled troopers by his rank would have fought against Caesar. Don't underestimate still what, you know, the military training of the nobility could be, but Caesar would have made the hand of a ham, right? In a single combat with Vercingetorix. But the Roman legionnaire was a military professional, trained intensely, brutally, traumatically trained. Maybe not so traumatically, maybe brutally, yes, but traumatically just is when you have to be suicidal, like those Gaisatae of the Celts, because there's no other way there for breaking but being suicidal. The Roman legionnaire wasn't like that. The Roman state paid a lot to train that masterpiece, so their logic was different. But of course, we can imagine that, in this mass levy of 52 BC in front of Alesia, the average Roman legionnaire was individually better than all those levies that included even serfs or slaves among the Gallic army. Right? If you take instead the average, more skilled, warband Gaul, well, surely that, individually speaking, was superior to a Roman legionary in single combat. We can't think about that, but unfortunately, it's collective training unfortunately for the Gauls that makes the difference, and in fact, the Romans held better in open field for that very reason, right? We can imagine Roman legionnaires' muscles being stiffer, right, rather than larger, and for a greater resilience more than a greater immediate force, right? That may be on average the difference, but even in there, you can imagine there were Roman legionnaires were pretty big guys themselves, especially think about centurions or people that had really to hold like in the first line. It was a matter of physicality, and we have no it's wrong when people think that these had to be like bodybuilders to be effective, right? We know it just from the modern military that actually the ideal soldier is nothing but a beefy bodybuilder, is just a very slim, agile, quick individual. At the time things were slightly different, but naturally they weren't. Human beings are just human beings. They're not supermen, right? And it's more about the general ability, just fencing in collective support and unit tactics, etc., that makes the difference, right? But the physicality in the sense of throwing yourself into a melee, right? That's something you can't find today, right? Unless you do it, which is it's not frequent very much. And the difference between a firefight is that you have to literally come there in front of the enemy and rip his guts off, right? And that's something that, more than the physicality of it, but just of the mindset of it. A Roman legionnaire would be someone who wouldn't give you even you would simply be pierced wherever you were uncovered, preferably in your neck, your armpit, and the legionnaire simply went for that. Did it in blink of an eye. Perfect killing machine, right? The Celt was as well, but in a more dynamic, more individual, even more evolutionary way, right? Being way more mobile, agile in many ways, but coming to closer hand-to-hand combat, the thing became very interesting, definitely. And in fact, the Gallic Wars in many ways are the proof of this fairly balanced odds after all. Right, of course, the Roman quality is much superior, but there are certain and the Celts try to compensate with numbers, but there are certain encounters in which the Celts demonstrate a brutal physicality. Right, the Battle of the Somme River, right, when the Celts, when the Belgians attack across the river, uphill the Romans that are putting camp and they're resisting. These guys charge uphill against a rain of Roman pila, right? And in order to do that with all your gear on, it's dramatic. And Caesar points that out, says these guys are freaking awesome, right? When he walks around there after the battle with all the corpses of those people were down there, says these guys were able. But it's not even about the physicality. The physicality tied to the mindset. Who would do that? That's a freaking feat, right? And that's why also the Belgian infantries are famous for in this regard. Naturally, the regular Celtic infantry tactic was a yelling rush, hurling javelins, and following it up without checking with hand-to-hand weapons. So actually not very different from the Roman one, simply less disordered. All this was accompanied by a dreadful din of war horns, think about the Carnics, all these noises that are not properly just, to make noise, as we disgustingly secularized it today, right? War was primarily a religious experience, for which even the Karnics, if you think about it, has a kind of animal shapes, animal form. All these warriors were devoted to the warlike deities, to their animal symbols, and the Karnics, the horns, other instruments were all used together with songs, etc. This is true among all tribal peoples. You can find it among the Germans. Among the Romans, it had been the same, actually, in archaic times. They were all aimed at replicating a multi-sensorial experience that would grow the soldiers closer to the deity, right? At this time, it seems that the Gauls, for example, had largely abandoned tattoos. Maybe especially the Belgians had it more, the Britons having more, but even in there, that sense of elite, of contact with the of elitary contact with the deity was mostly much more an aristocratic thing, perhaps among the Gauls. But fighting naked, bare-chested with all these tattoos, etc., was an apotropaic means, was a way to say, to look at me, deity. I'm fighting with your symbols. Give me strength. Make those javelins, falling somewhere else, not on me. And that was done not because they were silly not to use armor, but simply because they couldn't afford any armor. So that was just the best way they could say, okay, let's do it, as a bet. And actually, fighting naked, if you don't have any other armor, is kind of more convenient in many ways, because first of all, you are fresher, right? During combat, you get heated up a lot. You get, generally speaking, more agile, right? Also, nudity, the exposed virility intimidates the enemy, and it makes you appear more like a beast-like, and exactly in those ways that also those brotherhoods of warriors essentially conceptualize their being like. So there was a lot attached to this. Naturally, the Romans were very distant now from those practices, but in the Gallic world, you can see, in fact, this gradual abandonment as well. The more developed areas had lost that fundamentally. They had grown secular more in their way, while the ones in the north and in Britain, etc., they maintained that. As we were saying before, the myth that the Celts fought, every Celtic warrior fought as an individual, is in fact unfairly widespread, right? They obviously fought in formation as well, and they knew how to keep their ranks close, right? Never buy this thing that the Celts were just, individual fighters, because it's wrong, right? It's never existed in military history in the first place. And he would try, given the superior Roman equipment, because naturally the Roman legionnaires were well supplied by now statal, or at least private fabric industries conventioned with the state, with some very fine equipment. Like, of course, Roman legionnaires were covered all with armor, metal armor. The Celts largely weren't. So the Celtic warrior would try to use his superior physical strength to try to batter down the legionnaire in front of him. And that went naturally for any other enemy, for that matter. Attacks were made at great speed to naturally increase the impact of the blow. That was, counting on also cohesion, compactness, and often from concealment in woods or down a steep slope, right? So making the surprise effect by, that's not really what's gonna substantially make the difference. Surprise effect is greater. The greater it is, right? Not just steep slopes, but greater. Attack the enemy, for example, when he's marching in an ambush. That is important. The Gauls were surely able to move much more easily through difficult terrain, forested areas, than the Roman legionnaires were. This is absolutely true. The knowledge of terrain is in many ways, from smaller to bigger things, important. But even in here, naturally, don't underestimate a Roman legionnaire for that matter, because it's not that the Roman legionnaire just was raised into, urban contexts with paved roads and warm baths and so on. An average legionnaire would be like a proletarian raised from, someone who's lower class of, peasantry, living in the wild as well, in part. So, from realities that weren't very different, very distant, generationally speaking, even from a tribal context, right? So, that is to take into consideration. Successions of attacks could be kept up for as long as 6 hours on occasion, right? This is derived as an information surely by the account of battles, how much they lasted. Of course, this is exhausting, but it was done. There was a way to calibrate strength. That most combats, historically speaking, have always been like 2 or 3 minutes of melee and then like half an hour of recovery, because you simply can't do much more than that. If you fight for like 5 minutes, you already exhaust yourself, and you basically hamper your possibilities to revive during the day, to the fight, right? So everything was extremely calibrated from a physical point of view in terms of energies and so on, and that's also important. So also that's where the skirmishers had a great importance, because while the two ranks rested, there were these guys in front of them in the midst skirmishing. We know of bows, as we were saying before, used in a Gallic context. Here we don't know which one was prevalent between slings, archery. There is this say that, generally speaking, in the ancient world, the sling seemingly had an upper hand on the archery, but we're not completely sure. We have here the mention of these other types of troops that we have already actually described. Different variation from the normal rank and file warrior. That is, are the solduri, right, the devoted ones, the chieftain's elite bodyguard. They could be up to several hundred men. So we're talking about small armies, fundamentally. We're self-sufficient in many ways. Some of the best equipped units, actually, the Celtic world, the elite proper. The others are the Gaisati. The fanatic infantry who stripped themselves naked to fight. The Gaisati are, mostly famous for their performance in 224 BC at the Battle of Telamon in Italy, described by Polybius as keeping their normal weapons and shields, but wearing nothing but gold torque and arm bands. Right, the torque was this ring around the neck. It was also a prize of warfare. There is in the Roman sagas, there is a lot of references to individual challenges to combat between Romans and Celts, and there is even Titus Manlius Torquatus that takes the nickname, the cognomen, from having slain a Gaul. Individual combat having taken his torque as a prize. In fact, that was, as you know, a decoration actually in the Roman army that derived exactly from that reality, and partly also from literally, having slaughtered these Gauls. Think about, a typical, Caesarian veteran of the Gallic Wars. How many people he might have slaughtered in the first place, and all the loot deriving from it. The Gaisati were surely more common in previous centuries, right? That's the wilder element, as we've seen of this devotees, bands of warriors that were said literally to have fought even with spears and javelins, basically passing them, and presumably assuming certain substances not to feel pain, right? It was the whole deal of the religious military experiences, of this idea of visions, possessions, hallucinations, and the idea of simply fighting to the death without even realizing that we're trying to ease pain, because knowing that you were fundamentally devoted to that, and it was the way of naturally think who fought you on the other side in that sense. and just the psychological impact that it makes seeing someone that has like a a spear in his chest, keeps on fighting anyhow, right? That's an enormous deal. That's surely what an average Gallic farmer wasn't definitely used to do anymore. But as these brotherhoods in the more civilized Celtic world were in fact a bit like the berserker, like in the late Viking era. They were transforming mostly into brigands, into outlaws, people that didn't properly have a space in the more civilized reality, from which fortunately those societies had been emerging. They at the beginning they were, however, quite numerous, and we don't have to think that still at the time of the Gallic wars, in especially the outskirts of the wealthier Gallic areas, that these types of warriors were fundamentally still there, right, in number. Some Gauls, especially the Belgians, apparently were still using chariots, right, but they were dying out simply because this time probably those professional infantries, especially the mercenary ones that were out there and being hired by the great kings, the great lords, etc., were presenting too tough ranks for chariots to make a breakthrough in the first place. Those worked just in places like Britain, where in fact it wasn't much of a general cohesion, as we've seen, and it would remain confined there. And you say, someone will point out that, but you said that the Belgians had the strongest infantry, so why should they have chariots as well? Well, because some of them wouldn't have such strong infantry, or generally speaking, you could find chariots even in central southern Gaul by that time. It wouldn't make such a huge number in the first place. So, tendentially, just from terms of general development of Celtic society, that's a bit the trend, that with some exceptions like that. And always considered that the chariot could be used not just for passing through the ranks, but simply even skirmishing and bringing soldiers on the field to fight. So, right, but that has its limits as well. If you have cavalry, that's kind of more convenient by that point. And the Gaizati, fighting naked, were, in fact, closer to this idea that they were also tattooed, that, that connected them to, as we've seen, to the deity, to these religious traditions. The Britons still used that, the Gauls seemingly having abandoned this gradually. And Gallic towns often occupied hilltop sites fortified with timber-laced dry stone ramparts. Right? If such a town was not at hand, a campsite on high ground would often be protected by a wagon laager. Right? This is how they tended to preserve their possessions during March, during these migrations of people. There were several peoples that moved. There was the Helvetians, the Boii, right? The Boii also have come on the fore for some reason, I don't know, for video gaming, but they weren't actually particularly good. We can appreciate the fact that migrated orderly from Central Europe, today's Czech Republic roughly, to Gaul at some point during these years, but nothing particularly more than that. The Nori, the Noricum had the best smiths of Europe, of Central Europe at least. The Romans would absorb that craft from those areas. The Calbis Noricum, with which the Roman gladius starts being built, was in fact coming, as the name says, from those mountains in Austria, were still in fact iron with this high natural elements of carbon are to be found. So it is basically the problem of defining steel, right? That was technically even a very poor quality, but still the best that could be found around those times. Many ways other good centers were in Iberia, for example. So as we were saying before, the Romans had some general difficulties in fighting Gallic cavalry, mostly because of lack of light infantry of equal numbers of cavalry, or sometimes even light infantry, to scout out woods and defile and give warning of attack. The Gauls were probably better at that, but the Romans also had their own light skirmishers, as we've seen before. The same Gauls could be hired by the Romans, as it often happened throughout all time. During the Gallic invasion, the Romans had some Gallic ally, right? And they were watched carefully, right? Because they could change sides naturally. Spanish cavalry sometimes was a better answer, but also because they were too far from their homelands to desert in that context. But we've seen the German cavalry with their supporting light infantry were even better in the Gallic context. The lack of light infantry was compensated by the Romans, as we've seen, by the Balearic slingers, the Median archers, but these were, even less capable of, for example, coping with other skirmishers, because yes, they had distance from their own side, but they're generally more vulnerable, right? It could be easily taken over even by very light cavalry. And the average Celtic skirmisher could be even equipped for melee, right? So the ideal would have been to send these troops in entering woods and narrow places, but they weren't equipped enough to, in case they had found more suitably armed javelinmen from the Celtic side that could move at least as swiftly and could aggress them even in hand-to-hand combat. So that such mercenaries of Rome would refuse even to cover such role. And actually the Romans needed them for better employment as well. The legionnaires naturally were to accept that they were somewhat vulnerable to surprise in certain terrain. If they held the initial rush, their daily weapon practice, toughened muscles, and rank relief system would slowly give them the upper hand as their opponents tired. There was, even in here, don't think that even this idea of units swapping and so on was so always replicable, or at least that the enemies couldn't do the same, right? The Romans could do it in a more orderly way, but generally speaking, what really makes the difference is this main battle line, whether it holds, broadly speaking, or not. So even you can employ reserves, but reserves are not infinite. The unit has to maintain a certain cohesion, and so in fact the battles of the Gallic Wars were often very closely fought, right? It was very hard engagements against this very good Gallic infantry. And the legionnaire advantage would be lost when their opponents retired for a breather, right? Because a fierce follow-up at that moment could probably have won them the battle, but the legionnaires were rightfully prudent at the same time. Were not supposed to break ranks and pursue, right? In case they met fresh enemy having forfeited the advantages normally possessed by regular troops in good order. So it was rather the lighter infantry or cavalry, if the ground allowed it, to pursue effectively with minimal risk, right? And albeit maintaining that, of course, the wall situation is always dangerous. So it's never as easy as mechanically can mechanically sound, right? It always depends on what's the entity of the enemy at the end of the day. And in fact, a lot depended, banally, but by how much the same Romans got in terms of time, of supplies, of resources, of armament, right? Naturally, everything is subordinated to strategical needs. At the same time, we know some of the fastest marches in Roman military history are recorded in Caesar. In Caesar's accounts during the Gallic Wars, like covering hundreds and hundreds of kilometers in a few days in a row with maybe lighter equipment for these, smaller incursions, even to parry this or that blow on the strategical theater. So it was really the Schwerpunkt of the Roman legions during the Gallic Wars were probably the Roman legions themselves, right? And that's what Vercingetorix understood pretty well when he started carrying out a scorched earth strategy, because it was taking away Roman with guerrilla and and cutting the Roman supplies, etc. The very base of Roman capabilities, and that's why Caesar was obliged to confront him at Alesia, because he realized that if he had continued to simply try to put down every revolt here and there throughout all Gaul, his army would have ended up worn out, and so he obliged the Gauls to fight in an open field, in technically not, but still in the major big battle, so that it could be it, right, and maintain the advantage. Caesar was a great calculator, a great gambler, and he was lucid as hell, right? He was actually an emotional, sensible person, right? And slaughtering hundreds of thousands of people doesn't absolutely mean that you're not a sensible, emotional person, right? But he was also very cold in his decisions when he decided that it was it, and it was the most reasonable thing to do, and that's how you have to go with that. And he risked to be wiped out multiple times in his life, but at the end he had seen it better and longer, more far away than his enemies, and that's how he defeated them. Given all this risk of ambushes, of night attacks, exploiting this asymmetries that could compensate for the general ones existing between the Roman troops and the Celtic ones, the Romans made extensive use of field defenses against the Gauls. Right? They not only fortified a camp to protect their baggage as always, but often remained in sight to fight from it, supported by bolt shooting artillery. Right? That is something, for example, the Celts didn't have. And as soon as the Gauls' attention was firmly fixed on the face of the camp, when they were attacking in a breach or storming at the walls or a gate, cohorts, legionary corps, would file out of gateways in the other faces and take the attackers in flank, right? And the Gauls were extremely vulnerable to such flank attacks and invariably fled after only a short resistance, carrying their reserves with them. That is very important because naturally at that point the Roman legions were a fully professional army, at least in terms of Caesar veterans. There is no doubt about that, and they were capable of performing on a regular basis outflanking maneuvers and so on, which the Romans themselves had learned to do from a regular base only from the Second Punic War onwards, right? And the Celts didn't have the collective training for performing that, right? They counted much, as we've seen on the mass, so also it was critical to send in as many men at once. This reduced the reserves that didn't have much to cope with from flank attacks and so on. The Roman corps attacking, both on cavalry and on infantry, but still, the majority is, the cavalry was, after all, a small percentage. There were these other auxiliaries to compensate for that, but there were probably the Roman legionnaires that would surround the enemy as well as a major force. And if the Romans were to fight instead outside the camp, newly raised legions or road troops would not be trusted to send up the Gauls in the open, so would be left as a camp garrison, which is a very sensible thing to do. This is typical in many ways. In the toughest conditions, imagine, marching into enemy territories means when things get heated up, start approaching the enemy armies, and you're constantly under fire, right? You have to form this barriers of soldiers that have to fence off enemy attacks, enemy skirmishers, and so on, while the others build the camp under fire. That's what the Roman legionnaire has become by this time, properly an assault engineer. That's what the Roman legionnaire first and foremost is, right? This astonishing logistical military-engineering capabilities that surpassed by far anything that the Western world had ever seen by the military on a regular base. And the Celts didn't have way to cope with that, so just the Roman camps were substantial obstacles that they couldn't surpass most of the times, and against which naturally were disadvantaged on average. If they had difficulty to fight with legionnaires in open field, you can't imagine, in closed fields, attacking fortifications with artillery shooting at you. And in general, we have to give that the Gauls showed an extreme courage, determination, fanatism as well. I mean, these people were, at least the finest of their troop, were regularly, at least acquainted with the concept of fighting to death, right, or launching themselves into suicidal actions. As we have seen, this was all about what their raison d'être was in many ways, as clan leaders or noblemen or warriors. That's what they were meant to do, fighting to the death, right? Because that's what the men next to you expected from you. Here, for example, the solduri swore essentially a life oath to each other, right? Not differently from, like, think about the Macedonian Hetairoi did, or the Theban phalanx. These brotherhoods of warriors that would entrust their lives to one another because they knew that in battle that's what they could rely on. This is typical of them, and which meant that if I die, you die with me, in the sense that we fight to the death no matter what. And this spirit is to be found actually among the Romans themselves. In certain, that Caesar actually recounts. It doesn't say, our Roman legionaries were all cold and silent and always in line. No, think about the famous episode of Pullo and Vorenus, that is from the Gallic Wars, that eventually the HBO made the famous fiction Rome from, and that's if you read the book, they basically were fighting in that same individualistic sense, actually for competing with each other, but actually ending up to saving. Actually, it was Vorenus saved Pullo's life, if I'm not wrong, and coming back alive in the camp. And such feats were still enormously admired within the Roman spirit. That these were drilled guys, but were fundamentally those same Italic warriors that had been fighting the same individualistic mindset with the Gauls up to a very few centuries before. So that's something that the Romans didn't eradicate, and probably that they didn't even need to, because those were, even examples for the army in many ways. There are amazing individualistic feats of centurions during the Gallic Wars, stopping like swarms of Gauls and allowing the unit to retreat and dying, fighting an overwhelming amount of enemies. That's a kind of fit you can, that combines the warlike individualism to the reason and intelligence that the Roman army had acquired, from the civilization in general. So it's with the Celts didn't quite have, indeed, the same way. So that's a bit the dialectic that you have to get used when you talk about these topics. And I'm sure actually there would be a lot to talk about relatively to Gallic warfare and a lot of other aspects of this. Well, and we will hopefully come back on this actually, because this is just about Gallic warfare in a nutshell. But we will, as you know, we make videos also on the single types of troops, their equipment, more in detail, specifically dedicated to it. Entire hours just on this. This was just like an introduction, broadly meant. And we'll talk about all the other peoples, the Britons, the Germans, the Dacians, and so on, and throughout hopefully all the ancient world also, because some these people survived also for a longer time. And here we go. So we stop it here, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.